Here. Testing 1, 2. Hey, we're working. All right. Welcome back to this talk. We'll finish up the Exodus story, and then we'll move into Jesus and the prophets. Where we left off was the discussion about the tabernacle. We were talking about, that first scene in the Exodus story where you have the angel of Yahweh presents himself to Moses saying, take off your sandals, this place you're standing is holy ground. That idea of the holy space is ultimately kind of pictured in the story of the tabernacle, which later becomes the temple. And that tabernacle is a strange development in the Exodus narrative. If you've ever read the Exodus narrative, you maybe, it's like this thrilling drama, and, there are all these plagues, and they walk through the Red Sea, and then all of a sudden, the narrative gets to this really strange detail about all the different things in the tabernacle. And it was very easy reading, very action-oriented drama, and then all of a sudden it gets to be this strange thing with all these symbols that you don't know what to do with, because it's an ancient, weird drama that's written in a strange style with all these symbols for what's going on in the tabernacle. And it's meaningful to those people, but it's not meaningful to me. And this is where these two books here, I think, could help. J. Daniel Hayes' book, The Temple and the Tabernacle, and a book by G.K. Veal and Mitchell Kim called God Dwells Among Us. Both of them take that tabernacle and temple theme and show that if you understand this, it'll help you understand the entire Bible. The temple and the tabernacle theme is really significant in one way. If you kind of think of a house, how do you understand what's going on inside the house? You can look in different windows, and there are some windows we see through a glass darkly, but some windows give you better vantage points to see the entire architecture of the first floor anyway. So here in Exodus 15, we find the following. Exodus 15:16, you will bring the people you have purchased and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, your sanctuary. Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle, so you shall make it, he says in chapter 25. So this is the calling that the Israelites were rescued from captivity. They were rescued from the Egyptians, rescued from slavery. But there's another question. What are they rescued for? They were rescued for God's purposes. They were rescued so they could become a kingdom of priests, a worshiping community. And those are questions we could ask too. We were saved from, but then what are we saved for? We're saved for God's purposes. We are not our own. And we belong to our rescuer. And this is interesting here that you will bring the people you have planted and purchased. That language is there in the text too. I've kind of put it in brackets because it happens earlier. But the people you have purchased and plant them on your own mountain. It's interesting. They're not necessarily on a mountain early in this part of the Exodus narrative. I think it's hinting at the long-term commitment, because ultimately the sanctuary of God's presence goes on Mount Zion. And there are hints of this in the Torah. You'll find when it is revealed, the place that I am going to be bringing you, that's ultimately revealed, it's hinted at in the writings of Moses, but it's fulfilled in the days of David, that it ends up becoming Jerusalem. And that is the ultimate place that becomes the temple, the official place of sacrifice, and then also the official place of the ultimate sacrifice, where Jesus is sent outside the camp. But that place of the tabernacle that becomes the temple is there in the Exodus narrative, and it's important to recognize that that all the temple imagery, the temple themes that you see in the New Testament kind of hint back at what was first inaugurated in the Exodus period. So that tabernacle, the place of God's dwelling, was, we had to have a pure place. And with 3 different stages of holiness, and there's the most holy place, And it's protecting people from God, because it's a dangerous thing to remember. That there's even a scene where people touched the ark in a wrongful way and they were consumed. So God is revealing, like, this is holy, and holy is not common. All right, well, in John chapter 10, we have another one of these references to something related to the temple, and it's a feast called the Feast of Dedication. Does anybody know what the Feast of Dedication is? What is the Feast of Dedication? Yes, sir.
Does that have to do with the Maccabean revolt?
Maccabean revolt. What's another way of saying Feast of Dedication if you're a modern Jew? Hanukkah. You guys know your stuff. So Hanukkah is the feast of Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. The weird thing about Hanukkah from a modern perspective, so I was raised in a Jewish home. We didn't celebrate Christmas. We kind of didn't have a lot of Jewish theology, but we did have sort of this anti-theology. We didn't know what we believed, but we did know that we didn't worship Jesus and didn't celebrate Christmas. Probably the most important thing about being a Jewish kid is that you don't celebrate Christmas, which is really weird to all your friends and neighbors. We didn't celebrate Christmas, okay? We celebrated Hanukkah instead. Hanukkah is the celebration of the fact that the Maccabees revolted against Antiochus Epiphanes, this Egyptian Syrian ruler who was a kind of antichrist figure, who takes over the temple, sacrifices pigs on the altar, desecrates it. And this is maybe 150 years before the time of Jesus. And through the Maccabees, they are able to keep the temple from being totally desolated. And they rededicate the temple, purify it. And that is what is celebrated at Hanukkah. Weird thing about the celebration of Hanukkah today is that just 150 years later, the temple was totally destroyed. So we're going to celebrate, hey, the temple was protected, and later destroyed. That's, I guess, the asterisk that people don't pay attention. I didn't think about the implications of that when I was a kid. But yeah, the temple was protected and honored and saved. Yay! Oh, it was later destroyed? Okay. Well, again, it's just it was never intended to be the eternal, an eternal temple. In fact, there's a very unique confusion of that in the Old Testament that we'll look at when we get to the writings of the prophets. All right, so here's what it says in John chapter 10. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. Here is a reference in John's Gospel to an architectural detail. The Solomon's portico is probably this side, which you can't see. It's a little bit taller than this column, but it's the colonnades of Solomon, and it's a known detail called that in the Mishnah, in other ancient writings of the period. And so he's describing something that in language of the period. So he's not somebody writing a couple hundred years later and guessing. He's actually got accurate knowledge about the architecture. He does this in a number of places. The most famous, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate of the temple, a place called Bethesda with 5 porticos. He gets the 5 porticos right. He gets the name right, Bethesda. That language is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He talks about the sheep gate of the temple, which is also right, because Nehemiah talks about that. But he's referring to the sheep gate of the temple as if it's still standing. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate. That was destroyed in 70 AD, but he's writing about it using present tense. Just a paradigm shift right now in New Testament scholarship. Thinking about the implications of John's words, that in particular, and how it speaks about maybe an earlier John. Maybe John wasn't written in the 90s. Maybe it was written before 70. Daniel Wallace has been arguing this for decades. He wrote an article about that in 2001 about the present tense language. He can't find any use of this sort of what's called anyway, it's a grammatical argument that he makes in this particular piece that people are starting to pay attention to. Anyway, so here in this section, it's Jesus is at the temple, at the Feast of Dedication. It's winter, and it's in this context that he says in verse 36 of chapter 10 that he has been, quote, consecrated and sent into the world by the Father. Jesus has been consecrated, sanctified, set apart for holiness, and sent into the world by the Father. That idea of consecration is it's the word to consecrate, to dedicate, to sanctify, and that's language that we associate with this festival, because it was the feast of consecration, rededication, cleansing, and Jesus was consecrated, set apart for holy purposes, and sent into the world. He's saying he's the ultimate consecrated one, not this place. This place is going to be destroyed. He tells the disciples this. But he says it at this place, at this festival. He's the one who's consecrated. And in the desert, in the Exodus, there was a place that was set apart for the holy purposes to be consecrated, and that was the tabernacle. All right, here's where it gets really interesting. The language, again, of this angel of Yahweh who is identified as Yahweh. You find God the Father speaking about God the Son to the people in the Exodus period. Behold, he says in Exodus 23, verse 20, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. I mean, there's that scene, like when Jesus says, I tell you, rise up and walk, and your sins are forgiven, and rise up and walk. And so that you may know I have the power to forgive sin.
Yeah.
So you can't see that it really happened. You just hear the words. So that you may know I have the power to forgive sin, I say rise and walk. Because they could see the crippled man rising and walking. So he demonstrates the invisible by the power of the visible. The visible miracle is proof that he has the power to also do this. But they were saying in their hearts, who can forgive sin but God alone? And in this case, it's God alone, yes, but God and the messenger of God also has the power of forgiveness. And that's who Jesus claims to be. He claims to be the one sent by God. Look at John 14 now. In my Father's house are many rooms. If you know the King James, it's mansions. And there are a lot of people who say, Jesus has been gone 2,000 years. He's a carpenter, And if he's going to build mansions for each one of us, they got to be good. Right? It's just the word room, house, and it's a older translation. The word mansion is an older. Doesn't mean mansion the way we think of it. It's closer to the French maison, which is just a house, or a parson's manse, the pastor's manse. It's like that. It's just the word room, and it's the room within a house, not a mansion within a really, really big. What would it be, a dome over a city? I mean,
It's a room attached to a house. Is that not correct? I mean,
a manse would be.
But
this says,
as the family got bigger, you added.
In my Father's house are many rooms.
You added extras,
right? Exactly.
So that you could hold them just like we would.
Anyway, it's the point is that it's here. Jesus is saying, you're welcome, you're part of my family. It may not be like an actual room the way we think of it, but he's just saying there's room for you. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? See the Exodus resonances there? He's going to prepare a place for us, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Now, where is he about to go? He says this is part of the upper room discourse. Where is he going to go? He's about to go to Golgotha. His going to Golgotha is how he prepares us a place, because we don't have a place apart from his death and the lamb's blood being placed on the doorpost. That's where he's going and preparing us a place. The Targum of Exodus, the Aramaic translation, says this: but if you indeed heed the voice of my word, and do all that he speaks, then I will hate the one who hates you, and I will oppress those who oppress you. Notice that the word there isn't the speech, it's a he. If you indeed heed the voice of my word. In other words, the Targum of Exodus 23 interprets this angel, instead of saying the messenger, it talks about this word, the memra word in Aramaic, which is precisely the language John uses. In the beginning was the Word. And that is partly strange because it's one of the few places in the New Testament where we find Jesus called the Word. There are a couple of places, including Revelation, same author, but also Peter uses the word word, and an author of Hebrews, I think, as well, as I think referring to Jesus. Just like the Aramaic speaking Jews did. Okay, last festival, and that's the Passover. We've discussed the John 6 ceremony, or John 6 passage, which emphasized the bread, that he is the true manna. Well, as you get to the end of that 3-year ministry, the grand crescendo of all the feasts is the Feast of Passover, at which Jesus gives his life as a ransom for many. This is the ultimate Passover, in which all the themes that were hinted at in the original Passover, but now they are emphasized in a very crisp and clear way. John 19:23, it was the day of preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour, around noon. This is when Jesus was crucified. And if you were here with us last year, we talked about how this lines up. You know, was the Last Supper a Passover? And I argued that the Last Supper was kind of in the 1st century, they actually had a 8-day celebration of Passover. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, if you look in the Old Testament, is 7 days. But according to the 1st century, if you look at Josephus and Philo, they celebrated it for 8 days. And that first day was actually the day they ate up all the leavened bread. So the first day of the Passover, they called it the first day of Passover, but that first day was not the official one where they did the typical normal. They still called it the day of preparation. And it started at evening. So that first Last Supper would have been the first night when sundown happened. That's when they ate that first Passover, which was just eating up all the leaven. It was kind of they made it into a feast. Let's eat up all the leavened bread, and then we'll begin the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread after that. So after Jesus dies, the Jews say, they didn't want to go into the quarters of Pilate because they didn't want to be undefiled. They didn't want to be undefiled because of him, so that they could eat the Passover. And that there was a Passover dinner that night, and that was the first night of the unleavened bread. Anyway, that's just a refresher course for what we did last year. But this here indicates that the day of preparation of the Passover was about the day when Jesus was crucified. This was right before he was sent away to Golgotha, and it was about noon. Well, noon on the day of preparation of the Passover was the time when you begin slaying Passover lambs. So John is making this clear identification that Jesus is the Passover lamb who is being slain. So as we think about that in connection to the Exodus story, I mean, obviously the idea of the lamb's blood being put on the doorpost is a very rich and significant theme. So let's look at that narrative closely. Exodus 12, verse 2, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It wasn't the first month of the year. It shall be. This is such a monumentally new thing. It's going to be. Imagine thinking about like something so important. You change April to the first. Now we say March 31st and April 1st. That's now Happy New Year. That's what they did because it's such a monumentally important thing. This is going to be your new year, the first, which makes sense too. Like new life everywhere. Spring forth to new life. That makes sense that would be the new year. We should do that. Can we just change that? Oh, it's too hard to do.
Sir, in India, I was there in January. You want to be in India in January. You do not want to be there in any other time.
Exactly right.
So it's all beautiful.
So this month shall be for you the beginning of months. On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill their lambs at twilight. So because there were so many lambs to be slain, they started at noon and went until sunset. Okay, and then when sunset happens, it becomes a new day. So it's no longer Nisan 14, the day of Passover. So you got to get them all done before twilight. So they started around noon. Then they shall take some blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. It's the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn on the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you. I don't know when it happened culturally, but most people associate the Passover with the angel of death. But there's no angel of death in the scene. Who's passing over? It's Yahweh who passes over the house. Yahweh will not hold those with the blood. And the blood is a sign, he says, for you, which is interesting. But those homes are protected where there's the lamb's blood on the doorpost. And Yahweh is the one who passes over. And what is it that happens in this case? You had all these different plagues, but here, the final plague is that it's death. The firstborn son, and you think about the importance of the firstborn had the property rights, the firstborn had the right of kingship. The firstborn son becomes if the Pharaoh's son dies, you've just destroyed, the next king. And also all the gods were sort of, it says here, executing judgments on them. So they had like frogs as gods, and they had the Nile was a god, and so the Nile being filled with blood, like that god is slain, and all the plagues are basically saying the gods are out of control. Yahweh is sovereign over all the gods.
So didn't each plague represent a particular god?
Yeah, you can go through them one by one, and you can see that there. And here, the clear idea of the death of the firstborn is probably that since pharaohs argued that they were the sons of God, they were incarnations of Ra, the next pharaoh, the seed is cut off. He is sovereign over all gods, right? And also all over the property rights of the land.
By the way, this is also, is it possible in Jewish thought, there's a judgment that says, well, you killed off all my boys, let's see how you like it.
Right. It is the Lord's Passover. So this is the thing that separates the Israelites to become their own nation. They were slaves in Egypt. This is why it's called redemption from slavery, because redemption has a kind of a purchasing element to it, which we'll talk about. Here's the language we find from Jesus' period. He commemorates a kind of new Passover in the words of institution. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And so Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go prepare for us the Passover. It's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But again, that was an 8-day, it's called that. But the actual eating of unleavened bread happened in that 8-day scenario on day 2. But it's still called the Feast of Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's what Philo and Josephus say. Then came the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And so once that day happens, Nisan 14, that's when it's now evening. So you go from sunset when they have the Last Supper. Now it's Nisan 14, and later in the morning, that's when the lambs were sacrificed. So they actually have that first day feast in the upper room, the Last Supper, but it's actually on that same day because it starts at sunset, and that's the same day that lambs were sacrificed. And when the hour came, he reclined at table and the apostles with him, and he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And he took the bread. He took bread, by the way. He does not say azumos, it says artos. It's the word for leavened bread, not the word for unleavened bread. 2 different words in Greek, and this is the regular word for bread. And in other words, we don't have to be Jewish in order to celebrate communion or Passover. We don't have to go by, it's now an international kind of thing. We don't have to celebrate the Jewish festival because it reinaugurates this in a new way. And he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he likewise took the cup, and after they had eaten, he said, "This is the cup that is poured out for you. It is the new covenant in my blood." It's the new covenant in his blood. And we'll talk about that idea of the new covenant as well from Jeremiah 31. So what's being communicated here is liberation and redemption. So what do these signify? Let's take a look closely at Exodus 6:6, where God says, "I am Yahweh, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery." That's the liberation part. I will deliver you from slavery. I was recently listening to an interview with Bono from U2, and he talked about his song, "Bullet the Blue Sky," which has this reference to Jacob wrestling the angel. And he says, "I was at the time reflecting on liberation theology. And in liberation theology, you go to a church that's really talking about liberation theology, and instead of seeing like a picture of Pharaoh, you'd have like Ronald Reagan's face wearing the garb of the Pharaoh. In other words, it was a politicized version of liberation. There's nothing wrong with liberation theology if you get it right, because there is release from slavery, but political liberation is a different theology. Ronald Reagan isn't the problem. I mean, you can't have problems with bad politicians, but it's not our ultimate problem. It's a secularized version of the problem. So I will bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. That word redeem is the same word we find in the Greek word, nutrao. It's the word to purchase. And you find that purchasing language. You find it in Old and New. I am the sovereign Lord who bought you is something you find in the New Testament. We have been purchased. We have been redeemed. And I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God. It's not something you will feel in your heart. It's not something you'll have this sixth sense about. It's not just even like a leap of faith about. It's knowledge. Why? Because they walked through the water. It was very clear in very manifest ways that the nations knew about. Okay, that's the way it's presented anyway. So the whole idea that faith is this sort of leap of some kind isn't the way it's presented in the Bible. "And you will know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." This epic narrative was the story that defined the people of Israel, but as the history of redemption continues to unfold, we just discovered that the Exodus was just a hint of greater and more ultimate things to come, which is amazing because, again, it's definitional. The Israelites were slaves. We've been given this land by God. That's their identity. They have 1,000 different festivals and traditions to commemorate these things, and yet it's just prologue to this other Exodus is an amazing idea, which is what Moses and Elijah were saying when they spoke of his Exodus that Jesus was going to accomplish. The Son of Man, Jesus said, came to give his life as a ransom for many, a lutron. It's a redemption. And if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. That's liberation. He's still talking about that which he is going to accomplish. And just like we talked about with the water and the bread and the water gave them life, but the way he describes his mission is he's going to give eternal life. That's why it's the ultimate Exodus. Sweet. The death of the firstborn. Now, think about this. This is the thing that causes, that the last of the 10 plagues is what allows, finally, Pharaoh's heart to be open to the idea of, okay, send them away. He's mourning. And this is what you would expect in a grand epic where God defeats his enemies. It's triumphing through power. This is the kind of thing you expect. And he does. His glory, his power is demonstrated through this event. But when you think about this as foreshadowing for the ultimate Exodus, a complete reversal. It's not God slaying his enemies in this way you would expect. It's God's own firstborn son is slain. That which was depicted in the Exodus is what you would expect of any kind of, the typical narrative where our God's going to beat up on your God. And that's basically the way that he gets the attention for this greater story. And when he comes, what does Jesus say in the upper room? Many of the Gentiles, when they become lords, they lord it over the people. But it shall not be this way with you, but you shall be a servant. For the one who is greatest among you shall be their servant. And what does Jesus do? He washes their feet. It's an upside down gospel. Like, nobody's heard of this before. The whole idea of a servant leader didn't exist in the world. Washing someone's feet who is lesser than you never happened until Jesus came and then changed the way many people think about the world. And so it's washing people's feet, helping people in need, creating hospitals and orphanages became a thing after Jesus, not before. So rather than slaying the firstborn sons of his enemies in the new Exodus, God's only son, God's own son, that resonates with the story of Abraham, your son, your only son, the one you love. This is the language you find in the New Testament about God. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. With him I am well pleased. He's the one who dies. God's own son. God, in that analogy, is the Pharaoh who mourns his son. And that's how the Exodus happens. And yet, because he is not merely a human, he's really Yahweh incarnate. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. But it's a grand reversal because he is the firstborn of all creation who is slain. And it's the greatest story ever told. There's nothing like this anywhere. And the final story that I want to highlight for you as we close up our discussion of the Exodus is the very fact that Moses, Pastor Morlock hinted at this too, the shepherd imagery. Moses was barred from entering into the promised land because of the sin that he had committed in front of the people. And yet before his death, he prayed to God, asking God, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, that they may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. So the Lord said, take Yeshua, the son of Nun, a man who is the Spirit, and lay your hand upon him, and at his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in. And the short lesson there is Moses can't lead you into the promised land, but Yeshua can. That's Jesus' name. It's translated from Hebrew into English, Yeshua to Joshua, and we get Jesus from Greek to English, which is why it's Jesus, but it's the same name, Yeshua. Joshua can lead us into the promised land, but Moses can't. It's a very interesting thing. And there are a lot of people, a lot of Old Testament saints who have, it's very clear that their sin is very obvious. The Jacobs, the Davids, the Moseses. Moses was a very small sin. But they were barred as a result. They have issues. And they're called deceivers or, the sin of Bathsheba. Your sin has been dealt with. Psalm 51 for David comes to mind. We don't really have an indication of Joshua ever committing a sin. He's just kind of presented as a very upstanding man without a record of his sin. Anyway, so that idea that you need a Joshua to bring you into the promised land, the ultimate promised land, is certainly something that is being presented there. And Jesus himself comes and he says, I am the good shepherd who lays down my life for the sheep. So there's the death of he's laying down his life. He has the power to lay his life down and the power to take it up again. Just what we talked about last night with the story of the wrestling. He had the power to lose in the wrestling match, and the power to grant Jacob by pure mercy. You are more powerful than God. It's amazing. You're amazing. What a wrestler. You go, guy. That is an amazing story, but it's not a story of Jacob's strength. It's a story of God's weakness. Again, it's an upside down story that you wouldn't expect. That story of God's weakness is the theology of the cross. That's at the heart of the new covenant realities. So here are some books that I recommended on the Exodus theme. We've talked about the Echoes of Exodus. I highly recommend. If you're interested in the history, that this is real history, David Roll's books are very good. They are only available right now in electronic form, so you have to go to Amazon to order the Kindle versions. Nancy Guthrie really good for the theme of the Lamb of God, specifically really good for women's Bible studies. Seeing Jesus in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, she's got really good work there. The 2 books on the temple and the tabernacle I talked about. Also, if you are interested in more of an academic, more detailed, a thicker book, Beale's book, The Temple and the Church's Mission, really unpacks that theme of the temple throughout all of the Bible. Okay, I'll take a couple questions and then I'll start my discussion of the prophets. Anybody have any questions they want to throw at me? Yes, sir.
Geographically and spiritually, where is Zion today?
Geographically, Zion refers to, it's a poetic name for the Temple Mount. And so that's why people are called Zionists, because it's just a reference to, it refers to Jerusalem. It's kind of a synecdoche, a part for the whole. So Zion, the Temple Mount, becomes Jerusalem, it then is eschatologically thought of as that mountain that Daniel talks about that slowly takes over the world. So that eschatological Zion, and this is also there in Paul saying the heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem above, that's the ultimate Zion. So author Hebrews says we wait for a city that's still to come, not the present day city of Jerusalem. And Paul makes that same distinction. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're saying Zion's like a heavenly Jerusalem, the ultimate fulfillment.
You can think of it different ways. You can think of it as there are places in the Psalms where it's clearly referring to the earthly city of Jerusalem.
Right.
But then there are other texts, and Hebrew scholars will talk about this too, that often you find many of the writings of the prophets take the eschatology, the future hope is actually a heavenly Jerusalem, and there's a difference. So Paul isn't making stuff up.
In the Arthurian mythos, Logos is supposed to be like the King Arthur's Britain glorified, but Britain, so it's a similar concept.
Yeah, well, I would say
borrow it probably.
it's possible you could make that analogy because King Arthur probably has a historical reality. But the problem with that is that you are the linking it up to King Arthur would be to kind of take mythology and it's sort of writ large, whereas this is actual prophetic proven prophecies that we have, the short-term proven. That's why you can trust them for the long term. And so it's not just myth and speculation, it's actually very secure hope.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my point is that myth echoes what is true.
Right,
So
yes,
it's
yeah, that part's right.
Should I mail money to a TV preacher to rebuild Zion?
And get streets of gold first, though.
I would say go ahead and stop.
Let's go to the order of the day at noon, and then we'll stop.
We'll go all the way until noon?
Yeah.
Oh, that's only 20 minutes?
Okay, it is now. Yeah, can you split this one up?
Sure, yeah. I'll go till noon and then we'll take a break. All right. What can I get done till noon? So my life verse in many ways is Micah 5:2, because that's the first one that sort of shocked me out of my slumber. I don't remember why I was reading the book of Micah, but I found Micah 5:2, and I think I was attending college classes my first semester in college, and I had some religious conversations with people at work, and for whatever reason, I'm flipping through Old Testament, I found this passage, and talked about Bethlehem. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. And that ancient days is the word olam, which can also be interpreted eternal, everlasting, forever. So when I saw this for the first time, I went to the Hebrew Bible that was in the place we lived in. I looked it up, and there it was. Hey, I'll zoom in here. Right here at the bottom, this is house Bayit Lechem. And Bayit is an easy word to remember that means house, because whenever the husband would take the lady and say, hey, do you like it? She says, yes, bayit. And this is lechem, which is the word for bread. Jesus was born in the house of bread. Provides more resonance to he is the bread of life, because he was born in a bakery. And then I saw this in the Hebrew. I'm thinking, why has nobody ever told me about this? I've seen the Christmas specials. I told you this last night. I've seen the Christmas specials. So I decided to talk to some rabbis. And before I talked to the rabbis, I also discovered a few other Old Testament passages. One of them was Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is written 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. These are the words of Jesus on the cross. He quotes this, hinting at, that it might be significant to read to understand his crucifixion. They have pierced my hands and feet. Yep, it's significant. All the ends of the earth, the result, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall worship before you. If you look today, the most famous man of all human time and history is Jesus. He has the most followers of any other person, any other religious figure, any other historical figure. An Oxford University book just published less than a decade ago demonstrated this by all kinds of computer analysis of just how many times the word Jesus is referred to in human language. And 100 other data points. He is the most very, very well established, the most popular, well-known historical figure who ever lived. And this is, so the fact that you have all these promises, and we'll look at this as we discuss the prophets, there's a very thick stream of prophecies that talk about the fact that this is going to go international. Israel was a very small nation, and yet throughout its history, from the very beginning, the promise is this is going to go international, and you know what? It did. Isaiah 9:6. For unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. The child who's going to be born is going to be called Mighty God. That's a weird name. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. So he's going to have a government, and it's going to go on forever. It's going to hint at something we'll look at. There's another passage this is echoing. That's the idea that he would have an eternal kingdom. A couple of passages. The other passage that was sort of really influenced me was Isaiah 52 and 53. And just a couple lines from this. We'll look at it more closely later. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and exalted. So shall he sprinkle many nations. That sprinkle language is the same word where the priest would take the blood and sprinkle it on the mercy seat. Same word. And yet here, it's not referring to the atonement of Israel. He's sprinkling the nations. Kind of like what Pastor Morlock was talking about with the gathering of the entire world. It's right here in the Hebrew prophecies. He's sprinkling the nations clean. He shall sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. That may be one of the most under-noticed prophecies ever. I mean, think about it. Politicians and kings love to make decrees, love to hear the sound of their own voice. And here's something that happens that causes them to be quiet. Have you ever heard of a politician wanting to close their mouth? I've never heard of such a thing, but it happened. It happened. Kings around the world shut their mouths. Instead of making decrees, they listened to the proclamations of this rabbi from Galilee. He was despised and rejected by men. He was pierced for our transgressions. Again, we'll look at that more closely. But that was about 700 BC when this was written. We actually have copies of this from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know it's, one of the copies that we have predates the time of Jesus. So it's not something made up after the fact. Well, so what happened was I went to see some rabbis. I talked about this. My conversation with one of the rabbis, his name is Einstein, Rabbi Einstein. And he said, I said, well, what do you do with Psalm 22? They pierced my hands and my feet. Doesn't that sound like crucifixion? He says, I don't know. Bows and arrows? That's really what he said. It wasn't convincing. I said, it says he's going to come from, the Messiah will come from Bethlehem. And he said, well, it doesn't necessarily say the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. What it's saying is the Messiah is going to be related to King David, and King David was born in Bethlehem.
Yeah, there you go.
So I said, okay, whether or not that's what it says, now that the destruction of Jerusalem happened and all the genealogies are burned up, and how do you prove that he's related to David? He goes, that's a good problem. Wasn't convincing, but here's what they did. They gave me some books, and this was the main book they gave me. This book is called Faith Strengthened. And it's actually, I didn't know it until recently. I just wrote an article about this last Christmas, and I went to look back. This is the first theology book I ever read. And this book was written in the 1500s, and it's been in print in Jewish circles ever since. It's kind of like a refutation of Christian views of, Jesus being the Messiah. Here's, when a Christian comes to you and says, ... So I'm going to read you a couple of lines from this just to give you a sense of how Jews answer some of the claims that these are messianic prophecies that are fulfilled in Jesus. He says, when a Christian asks, of whom did Isaiah prophesy in chapter 9, verse 6, when he said, unto us a child is born? And Troche answers by saying, quote, those passages refer to Hezekiah, king of Judah, during whose government Israel experienced, through divine intervention, a signal deliverance from Sennacherib. He is the Prince of Peace, because the peace granted Israel in the days of Hezekiah. So here, the question is does that actually, okay, you're saying that Hezekiah is the fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, let's ask ourselves a few questions. Does this work? Hezekiah and Isaiah were contemporaries, right? Hezekiah actually was the king in charge when Isaiah was ministering. We actually found artifacts, there's a seal that was discovered with Hezekiah's name on it in, less than a decade ago. And it's interesting because the icon on it actually looks somewhat Egyptian. And it's weird to think, but they were just very close to Egypt. And then a couple of years later, we found a seal, a bulla that said the prophet Isaiah. So we actually have archaeological artifacts reflecting both, and they were found in Jerusalem, around the same area, an area where one of the earlier temples used to be. So they were, and they date to the right time. So they were contemporaries, and Isaiah is saying a child will be born in the future. And in fact, if you look at the beginning of that prophecy, it's very clearly indicating that this is going to take place in the latter days. That language, latter times. So that doesn't seem to fit for Hezekiah, number one. The fact that he is called Mighty God, Troche says, is a feature of the Hebrew language, which allows the application of the name of the Almighty to human beings and even to inanimate objects. Okay, that sounds a little strange. We can refer to anybody, any normal king as Almighty God. That seems to be, to me, a little bit of a stretch. When Christians point out that the child promised by Isaiah was to reign forever on David's throne, he shall have an eternal kingdom, Troche responds by saying, the expression without end is just a figure of speech. All right, so what do you think? Compelling? I didn't think it was compelling either. So some people ask, well, why don't you call yourself a Messianic Jew? It's like, well, I just thought the Christians had it right, and I just, I don't think there's nothing wrong with calling yourself a Messianic Jew. I particularly wasn't ethnically Jewish. I was adopted by a Jewish stepfather, so I became Jewish, and so I'm not ethnically Jewish. But yeah, as I read the Christian interpretations and the Jewish interpretations, I think it's pretty clear that these things were really fulfilled by Jesus, and the arguments against them were just very weak. All right, here is the big problem, though. Once I started talking to the rabbis, I discovered that they did have discussions about the Messiah that I never heard about growing up. It's like, why are you talking about the fact that Jesus isn't the Messiah, but there is a Messiah? But why don't you ever talk about it? There are all these passages that seem to be hinting at the Messiah. Well, when you go back to the ancient Jews, there's a lot of conversations about the Messiah. I mean, it was everywhere. Here's just a few from the Dead Sea Scrolls. When God has fathered the Messiah.
Wow.
Wait, what? When God has fathered the Messiah.
Wow.
Another one, 4Q, 2:52. Until the righteous Messiah, the branch of David, has come. For to him and to his seed, the covenant of the kingdom of the people has been given for generations to come. That sort of fits with the themes that we've just read from Isaiah. Another one. Heaven and earth shall listen to his Messiah. Heaven and earth. Okay, yeah. Now that I think about it, when Jesus came, the waves obeyed him, the storm, the seas, the wind stopped. Heaven and earth. Yeah. Targum, Micah. So here are a few translations of the prophecies that I was looking at. But translations in Aramaic where they add information in, showing you how they're interpreting it. Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem, from you shall come forth for me the Messiah, executing the rule over Israel. Remember, the rabbi told me it's not referring to the Messiah, it's referring to David. Well, these ancient Jews believed it was about the Messiah. I didn't know it at the time. I only discovered this like less than a decade ago. Targum 9:6, Isaiah 9:6. His name has been called from before, the one who causes wonderful counsel, God the warrior, the eternally existing one, the Messiah who will increase peace. Okay? It didn't interpret this as being fulfilled in Hezekiah. It interpreted it as the Messiah. So when people, if you hear the typical Jewish interpretation of a lot of texts, if you have this in your back pocket, that ancient Jews, actually there's a diversity of opinions, and many of them did interpret these messianically, even around the time of Jesus. Which, by the way, is why he was so popular. I mean, why did he have so many followers? There's the line from Luke's gospel, which says, many myriads of people were following Jesus to the point where some people were being trampled. Which, by the way, is a very strange thing to add into the text if it never happened. Like, if a guy came, really fulfilled the Messiah, but he didn't really exist, why would you write that he was popular in Jerusalem and Samaria and the Decapolis and he was going all these places, seeing thousands? That word many large crowds and sometimes myriads of crowds is like 144 times in the Gospels. It's a weird thing to add if it didn't happen, because then everybody would know, well, that never happened. And then it wouldn't have ever got started. But you do have that language in the New Testament era. By the time you get to the 60s, what the Romans are saying matches what Acts is saying, that there were innumerable followers of Jesus. Many of them were being persecuted. That's both in Acts and in Tacit. Tacit is another. Okay, so the next one, Targum Isaiah 52 and 53. Behold my servant, the Messiah. This is the main passage that I thought here is it's like a picture of the story of Jesus in miniature. And it's here in the Old Testament. And this is he was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and he's pierced for our transgressions. And I try to show it to family members, and they just, I don't know what to do with that, and can we change the subject? And you talk to the rabbis, and they say, well, the Jews have always said, this is not about the Messiah. This is about the suffering of Israel over the centuries. That's what I was told. This is just the suffering of Israel. It turns out many Jews thought about this as the Messiah. Here's a passage right here. The Targum translation, the Aramaic version says, the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 is the Messiah. That part there is from 52:13. The next part, it was pleasing to refine and purify the remnant of his people so he could cleanse their life from sins. They will see the kingdom of their Messiah. That's in 53:10. Both of those chapters are applied to the Messiah. We'll look at that more closely in the next hour because we're running out of time here. But it's interesting because that whole passage, the Aramaic version, interprets it in ways that are clearly Jewish and not Christian. And yet there are some things that they concede that are definitely parallel with things Christian. And the last one I want to point out to you is from the Mishnah. With the footprints of the Messiah, scarcity increases. It's arguing that there will be a time of scarcity and challenges when the Messiah is about to come. But they were expecting the Messiah to come. This is what I will conclude with here. I can do this in 5 minutes. The Melchizedek scroll is one of the most fascinating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This scroll I discussed on a recent episode. What episode was that? I think my episode on Daniel, I had a clip from Craig Evans, a notable New Testament scholar who was discussing this. There are some fascinating things about this scroll because it is showing you how ancient Jews from before the time of Jesus were interpreting many of their prophecies. And once you see how they're interpreting their prophecies, then you say, oh, the Christian interpretation is not weird. It's not unusual. It's actually just in line with these ancient Jews. We have very much in common with it. They were looking forward to what Jesus would do, and we're looking after the fact, but we both have the same view. The Melchizedek scroll it talks about the Messiah, but it names him Melchizedek. He's a very interesting name. We find that in the Old Testament, that idea of giving a name. This is more of a speculative thing. We don't think of it as scripture, but we do say they were definitely reading the Old Testament in line with the way that in some cases it was intended. Ezekiel says, I will become the shepherd of the sheep. And then later he says, and I will send my servant David, and he will shepherd the sheep. But David's been dead for 300 years. Why David? It's a metonymy. It's a metaphor in a name. And that name, David, is applied to the son of David. Okay, but Jesus isn't called David. He's called son of David. In the same way, Melchizedek is being used that way. It's a metonymy to describe the Messiah's work. And we'll talk about that. Why is it called Melchizedek in just a bit? Here's what this says. This is fascinating. The Jubilee applies to the last days. He's quoting actually Leviticus, the idea of the Jubilee, and we'll explain that in a second. Applies to the last days and concerns the captives, just as Isaiah said, to proclaim the Jubilee to the captives, Isaiah 61:1. By the way, anybody remember the text of Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth? When he unscrolls the scroll of Isaiah, what chapter does he get to? Isaiah 61. And he to proclaim the Jubilee and the freedom to the captives. This has been fulfilled in your hearing, he says. This is written 100 years before, and it's really highlighting that prophecy, which is amazing. But he says, Melchizedek will proclaim to them the Jubilee and release them from the debt of all their sins. So this coming Jubilee period, it's a releasing of the captives. Again, that's a liberation theme, an Exodus theme. And it's going to include the forgiveness of debts, of sin. This word will thus come in the first week of the Jubilee period that follows 9 Jubilee periods. Then the Day of Atonement shall follow at the end of the 10th Jubilee. Day of Atonement, though, was every year. What's this? This is an eschatological, an end-time atonement, like a once-for-all atonement. Shall follow at the end of the 10th Jubilee period, when he shall atone for all the sons of light and the people who are predestined to Melchizedek. Okay, so 10 Jubilee periods. Now, Leviticus is a tough book. I get it. But if you go through and you kind of look, there are different periods. There's one announcement of Jubilee is a 7-year period. There's another one that's this 49-year period. And that's the one where you had cancellation of debts and people who'd sold their land get to go back. That 49-year period, if you have 10 of them, that's a 490-year period. Anybody know what prophecy this person in the Dead Sea Scroll time is alluding to? A 490-year period? Okay, well, let's see if I have time to do it now. Yeah, I have 2 minutes. When he finished reading chapter 61 of Isaiah at the synagogue of Nazareth, Jesus rolled up the scroll and said, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. It's amazing how many similarities there are here. But let's get into Daniel chapter 9. Daniel 9 is this prophecy of the ultimate Jubilee. And the person who wrote this scroll is definitely seeing Daniel 9 as this sort of eschatological promise of the ultimate atonement and the ultimate Jubilee. Here's what it says in Daniel 9. 77s, that's 490, have been decreed for your people and your holy city to make an end of sin, to atone for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Remember, we read some of the ancient church fathers applying that to Jesus. He is the Holy of Holies. No one understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed prince, there shall be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. The anointed prince in Greek, Christos, what's the prince, I forget. But it's basically, I think Christos Kurios, the Christ the Lord almost. I may not be the Septuagint, maybe other people writing that in Greek. Anyway, it's very clearly, in Hebrew, it's Mashiach, Messiah. So you can translate it, the anointed prince or the prince Messiah. There will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be built again with streets and a moat, even in time of distress. And then after 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Cutting off of this, how could that happen? How could he be the anointed Messiah who's not cut off? That's a signal of death or covenant curse or both. Cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince to come, wait, a different prince is in you now, will come and destroy the city and sanctuary. I just had a show where I discussed this in depth, quoting ancient fathers, quoting lots of people. The prince in view here is the one who destroys the city and sanctuary. That's Titus, the prince of the empire, son of Vespasian. That's the argument I make. And I quote a lot of church fathers who agree with that. Its end will come with a flood, and to the end there will be war, desolations are determined, and he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. It's a structure in Hebrew. You went A, B, now it's going back to A, and then it'll go to B again. A, the main prince in view, the anointed prince, he will confirm a covenant. Okay, he's the one who confirms, he's confirming the covenant, the one promised all the way back throughout the history of redemption, the new covenant. This is the new covenant in my blood, he says in the upper room. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, for a 7-year period. Think of the beginning, he's anointed, John the Baptist. In the middle of that, he's cut off, and he continues to send the Spirit, call the Apostle Paul. He interrupts the Apostle Paul. It's this 7-year period of a lot of activity that is the renewal of the inauguration of the new covenant. But in the middle of the week, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. That's the middle where he atones for sin. And then, on the wing of abominations, one will come who makes desolate. That is the other prince who comes, and he makes desolate after the time of the Messiah. This is another reason why you need to think of the Messiah as not somebody who is to come. He had to come before the destruction of Jerusalem, because this is what the prophecy says. Josephus even writes this. Josephus says that Daniel was such a clear prophet. He spoke of things that, not just things that would happen, but also the time that they would be accomplished. And he did argue that Daniel also prophesied concerning the Romans, and that Jerusalem would be made desolate by them. He's thinking of this prophecy. All right, let's end here. Let's take a break. We'll have some lunch. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I am. Let's take a couple questions, and then we'll go to lunch. Any questions? Yes.
How do you spell metonymy?
Metonymy. You mean Melchizedek?
No. Use
Metonymy.
metonymy.
Metanym. N-Y-M-N, I believe. Metonymy. Metonym, and then O-N-M-Y for the other ending. Metonymy. Metonym. It's basically changing of the name. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that John's gospel may be dated a little earlier. We typically date around 80 AD, I believe.
Yeah.
His life.
80 to 90 is what people say.
Right. But what would be interesting is, when do we have the date for Peter's death and then the destruction of the temple? That's 70. Peter died about 66, we believe.
64 to 67, somewhere in there.
Okay, so that would be an interesting point to be between there. It's after Peter died, but before the destruction of the temple could be a possible date. The reason I'm saying that is because he's speaking of Peter in the past and how he died.
Actually, I don't think he does speak of it in the past tense. It looks like he's in the past tense. When you actually look at it in Greek, he says, he spoke concerning the manner that Peter will, future tense, glorify God.
Interesting.
Yeah.
About which you would go, well.
And I talked to Daniel Walsh, a New Testament scholar, about that very passage, and he said, yep, I think that's right. I think he's actually been, from the narrator's perspective in time, he's speaking of Peter's death as if it's still a future event.
Okay, and are you familiar with the Eritrean death masks that they talked about? These masks the Eritreans had? They did a paper mache and they put a light gold over them, and they only did this for a specific time. The reason this is important, they recently found a part of the Gospel of John in those, and those masks stopped at 120 AD because of the gold or whatever, but they're paper mache, they grab leftovers, make this
So there's a
mask,
fragment
put
of
the
John in
gold
some of those?
and it was
I've heard of those, that the fragments being found that.
fragments are being found, and they found a fragment of John's gospel, so
All right, I'll let you know.
all that late date is gone now.
It's true, there's a paradigm shift right now in New Testament scholarship. Richard Bauckham, N.T. Wright, another guy at Cambridge, John Dixon, a lot of these guys are, Peter J. Williams, they're all saying, yeah, things are changing in the academy, which is great because for so many years, John was set aside as the late gospel. It's not history, it's theology. It's sort of taking the theology and writing it back into a gospel narrative. So you can't trust it historically. And that's all being rethought by liberals, not just conservatives. All right. In fact, it's the conservatives who are, behind the times. If you talk to the D.A. Carsons and a lot of people who are conservative evangelical scholars, they are still they hold the late date still. They're not. The liberals who have seen the dead end of liberal scholarship who are coming to conservative conclusions now. All right, let's take a break.
12:30.
12:30, come back.
Let's pray. Father, thank you for this meal, this provision. Thank you for the message, Lord. Help it to equip us